Welcome to the CEC Report for the 29th of June. I'm Elisa Barwick, and joining me today is CEC researcher Robert Barwick. Welcome, Robert.
Thanks, Elisa.
And on today's show, People 1, Banks 0, Glass-Steagall solution introduced in Australian Parliament, and foreign interference laws are a fascist fraud. So firstly, People 1, Banks 0, Glass-Steagall solution introduced in Australian Parliament.
We did it.
Yes, on Monday the 25th of June, Bob Katter, the member for Kennedy, introduced our Glass-Steagall legislation on the floor of the House of Representatives. This separates, of course, banks with deposits from those with risky speculation. Now, this was a historic moment for this country. Therefore, we're going to play in full Bob's speech at the second reading.
And I call the clerk.
Private Members' Business, Notice Number 2, Banking System Reform, Separation of Banks Bill 2018.
And I call the member for Kennedy.
I present the Banking System Reform, Separation of Banks Bill 2018 and the explanatory memorandum.
Members leaving the chamber could do so as quickly as they can. The clerk.
First reading, a bill for an act to re-establish confidence in the banking system, to separate retail commercial banking activities involving the holding of deposits from wholesale and investment banking involving risky activities and for other purposes.
The member for Kennedy.
I move this bill be now read a second time.
The member for Kennedy may proceed. Yes.
Second.
Yeah.
The great upheavals in the Western democracies, the so-called free economies, which are really mixed economies, occurred, the greatest one being 1929, the Great Depression. I think to understand what has taken place, you must read John Kenneth Galbraith's The Great Crash. Very erudite, very readable. You must read The Bold Riders, which the crashes of the 1980s, the late 1980s in Australia, the Laurie Connells, the Alan Bonds, the dreadful crash that occurred in Australia then, Trevor Sykes' The Bold Riders, and you must read, of course, the Big Short, the American book that came out after the GFC collapse. Speaker, having said that, the Great Depression was immediately addressed by the Congress of the United States with the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933. The Depression hit right at the end of 1929, effectively started in 1930, and within 3 years they had drafted legislation to ensure that this would not occur again. And in that magnificent, small but magnificent work of Galbraith's, he quotes the congressional hearings. And I don't know the names of all the companies, Mr. Speaker, but they asked Goldman Sachs, they said, so you, in fact, owned a company and floated a company called, I'll call it Whitehaven, and Whitehaven, that's yes. And Whitehaven's total assets were shares in Blue Seas, yes. And Blue Sea's total assets were ownership of Silver Surf, and Silver Surf's total assets were the shares in, and it went on and on and on. And in actual fact, the only thing that any of these 19 companies owned was shares in the parent company, right back to Goldman Sachs, who'd floated it off with about 0.00001% of their shares. So they floated off a company with a share issue in Goldman Sachs, which was of negligible value to Goldman Sachs and negligible value to the people. But what we're talking about here, that is called derivatives. When you don't buy a loaf of bread, you buy a contract to buy a loaf of bread. And that is what we call a derivative. Glass-Steagall came in and it overcame the vast bulk of those problems, so that the American economy ran fairly effectively to make it 3, 4, 5 times the size of any other economy on earth, until Mr Bill Clinton, Mr Free Markets, himself, even in the notorious movies about him, is addressing workers and telling them all that they'll be much better off when we free all the markets up. And you will take some pain in the shorter term. In 1999, he abolished the Glass-Steagall Act. Within 2 years, the dot-com collapse occurred, taking down trillions of dollars of the savings and superannuation and retirement monies of Americans and the rest of the world. And in 2008, we're all familiar with the GFC. Now, I mean, clearly, that timeline indicates the necessity for Glass-Steagall legislation in this place. And I must single out, by way of thanks, because it's one occasion where I did not do the hard work on the bill, thank Anne Pleach, my Chief of Staff, but Robert Barwick, associated with a number of organisations in Australia, very articulate, very intelligent, and done some excellent work here. Wilson Sy, who's one of the great Australians, as a whistleblower, but also, you know, I don't like that term, he was a man who had the courage to say the truth when the truth was going to cost him greatly, but would be a great contribution to this nation. So we played Dr Wilson's side very great. And Bob Butler, who did a lot of the solid work in drafting this bill and bringing it into the Australian economy. Swan and put money into circulation the minute the GFC hit. And history books will be very, very kind to Wayne Swan as a treasurer. The opposition complained that it was given to people just to go out there and spend. Well, that's exactly what you do in a depression, to head off a depression. I mean, it was an incredibly stupid statement by the opposition at the time. Swan and Hockey guaranteed the big 4 banks. And that was a very good thing for both of them to do, both sides of the parliament, and I think that that needed to be done. So we headed off, and the other thing that really headed it off was the terrible evil in Australia, which is recourse lending. So if you can't make your house repayments, then the house is taken off you and sold out from under you for less than its loan value. So the bank has the debt and you become a wage slave for the rest of your life. You carry that debt and that debt accumulates interest for the rest of your life unless you take bankruptcy. So, Mr Speaker, the situation in Australia is ugly and it is evil, and this legislation is needed to overcome those problems. And what effectively it says is, Mr Bank, you are no longer out there in the market, the arena, buying and selling. No, your job is to loan to people that buy, sell, develop, invest. You don't do that, you judge them. And the bold writers, the Laurie Connells, the Alan Bonds, all of those people from that period, if Alan Bond in fact had been restrained by prudential bank action, he would today be a great hero because he did a lot of wonderful things. And similarly with Christopher Skase. If he'd been restrained and controlled by prudential banking, APRA is not worth 2 bob, but if either of them had been restrained, they left great monuments for the Australian people. One of them being which is not working today because of another bold writer, the nickel plant in Townsville. I mean, those most beautiful tourist resorts in the world. These were the things that these people created. But because they had the non-prudential banking system that allowed them to do whatever they like, they went out on splurges, which destroyed all of their good work and took millions of Australians down and destroyed their savings, their superannuation and their little bit of security that they had. Mr Acting Speaker, I include on this note, I jumped university because everyone was making a fortune in mining, and my now wife, she invested some money in a company called Toledo. I read the prospectus, and there was more copper. It was the year before decimal currency. There was more copper in my pocket than they had in all of their copper reserves of this so-called mining company. And I said, I love this share market. This is the greatest mechanism ever devised by man for a smart country boy to take money off dumb rich city boys. So I jumped university to go out in the mining boom. The crash came, and but we still bought mines into production. Mr Speaker, the housing boom in Australia today, I mean, does anyone seriously think that we are not sitting on the brink of disaster? A quarter of Australia's population, maybe a third, live in Newcastle, Sydney and Wollongong. The average price of a house is over $800,000. That means 50% of the houses are over that value. And yet the average income for an Australian after tax is about 50 grand a year. So I mean, how are they going to make their payments on a house? And yet they're buying houses. The banks are financing. Well, the banks make money when you go broke and they sell the house out from under you. They don't lose money. They make money out of what has occurred. They should be held responsible. Mr Speaker, I would love to be in a business that is guaranteed by the government. If I buy a corner store and I know that if I go broke, the government's going to give me the money, everyone will be buying corner stores in Australia. But they are given this, but there is no responsibility placed upon their shoulders to act in a prudential manner. And the recent economic history of Australia proves absolutely that they have never involved in that. And I conclude by a quotation from Robert Menzies: government must be involved if our economic democracy is to be preserved. I don't often quote him, but I will on this one.
The member for Kennedy's time has concluded. Is the motion seconded? The member for Denison.
Mr Speaker, I'm delighted to second the indefatigable member for Kennedy's bill and reserve my right to speak.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time. The time allotted for this debate has expired. The debate is adjourned, and the resumption of the debate will be made an order of the day for the next sitting.
So, Elisa, you can see you had the wholehearted support of Andrew Wilkie there. I got to interview Wilson Sy, who was with me, who Bob Katter kindly singled out with myself and Bob Butler for working on this bill, and this is what Wilson and I discussed in Canberra on the day. This is Robert Barwick reporting from Parliament House in Canberra for the CEC Report, and I'm joined by Dr Wilson Sy, the former Principal Researcher of APRA. We've just witnessed Bob Katter introducing the Australian Glass-Steagall legislation to Parliament, the Banking System Reform Separation of Banks Bill 2018, which is quite historic. So now we've got the bill in play into Parliament to get it passed. Wilson, a couple of things. What are your impressions? And just for the sake of the viewer, how important is this legislation for Australia?
Well, I think the financial system is too complex for the regulators. There is no derivative regulation to speak of, with $45 or more trillion of exposure, which are not even understood.
So derivatives.
Of derivatives.
Yeah.
I think we need a much simpler system for the sake of Australian businesses and for the sake of all the problems with the housing bubble. And I think Glass-Steagall will help in a lot of these problems that we're having.
So we're going to keep working in Parliament while we're here today, talking to more members of Parliament about this. But we only got to this point because of you, the viewer, the CEC supporters and acquaintances around Australia that have been helping with this by lobbying members of Parliament. So the bill is now in play, right? And now we've got to get support for it over the coming period, so we get it debated and we get it voted on and we don't let them delay it. So that's us signing off for the CEC report from Canberra. So there you go. It was exciting to be there. Let me just emphasise though, it's the people who work with us out in the community that are responsible for this. Now, your work is going to be very important to actually getting it debated, etc. So keep working with the CEC, Get a copy of the latest Australian Alert Service where we elaborate on what happened this week. Call your members of parliament now. It's not about getting the bill seconded, it's about getting it passed.
Yep, we'll be right back. Welcome back to the CEC Report, where we're discussing the tabling of our Glass-Steagall legislation in the Parliament this week. Now, Robbie, what's the significance of what Bob Katter has done here?
Elisa, it's huge. The banks are going to hate it. They do hate it. They hate it because it's going to stop them from gambling with our deposits. They also hate it because it's the government asserting its authority back over the banks and saying, here's how it's going to be done right, don't step out of line. They hate that more. And to illustrate this, I want to play a clip from the United States 3 years ago, where in the lead up to the US presidential election, a candidate who our friends over there worked with, Martin O'Malley, who didn't end up going anywhere, but he launched his campaign by taking on Wall Street and announcing Glass-Steagall, right? And for doing that, he got called Wall Street's public enemy number one. And I want you to see this clip to have a look at it.
You can't even risk going the Democratic route. Well, that's something Charlie Gasparino has been picking up from a lot of the bankers, brokers he talks to, especially when they hear not Hillary Clinton, but this other guy, O'Malley. Charlie now in New York on this, I guess, doubling down on batting down the classes, right?
Well, I just want to say I have my Rick Perry glasses on, and I actually, he inspired me as a fashion choice. So just the governor won me over on that.
That's just a total snide aside, but I admire it. But go ahead.
Listen, Martin O'Malley is now, like, I would say, persona non grata, public enemy number one in the halls of Goldman Sachs, in the halls of BlackRock, the big money management firm, all throughout Wall Street right now. I mean, what he said Saturday, and Fox News picked it up, he basically borrowed a page from one of the columns I wrote about how Wall Street is fine with either Hillary Clinton or Jeb Bush. They think both of those candidates would be very well for their bottom line. He picked that up in a way that the Wall Street was not expecting and ran with it, put it in his speech that said he was going to run for president, run for a Democratic nomination. And right now, people on Wall Street are talking about Martin O'Malley. Now, and what they're really worried about, I believe, is not that he's going to win, is that he's going to force her so far to the left with that resonating message that she doesn't do some of the things they want her to do, like water down Dodd-Frank. I mean, they really think that if she gets in there, if Hillary Clinton gets in there, Dodd-Frank will be watered down to a point where they can do proprietary trading, using their own capital to trade, which is outlawed right now. That various aspects of Dodd-Frank will be freed up so the banks can go back to making a lot of money. Not that they don't make a lot of money now, but even more money. Clinton-era money. And he's going to raise that issue with them. The question is, does he force her to do something really outrageous, like call for a breakup of the banks? I mean, I wonder if she goes that far. Anyway, that's what people are saying on Wall Street.
She might hint it, but she might not do it, you know. So we'll see. We'll see.
You got it.
So as you can see, Lisa, the issue was because this guy pushed Glass-Steagall. And what happened? Well, Hillary Clinton didn't adopt Glass-Steagall, but Bernie Sanders did. Donald Trump did. They all campaigned on it. The Democratic Party and the Republican parties both adopted it in their platform. And Wall Street was flipping out, and they've been flipping out ever since. Trump hasn't come back to Glass-Steagall, but this is one of the reasons he's been very distracted by the Russiagate stuff, etc. Right? But what it did, it set in train all these things that Wall Street did fear. Now, over a couple of days ago, a Bernie Sanders-backed candidate did achieved an upset in the primaries in New York against an establishment Democrat, and she campaigned for Glass-Steagall to do it. Glass-Steagall is now out of the box worldwide, and what Bob Katter's done here is not just significant for Australia. The banks around the world are going, oh my God, this is what we fear. And as you know, like banks in Wall Street, in London were going, oh no, this might lead to people talking about breaking us up here, right? So that's the significance of what it's done, and that's why if we push it here, it's going to have global ramifications.
Yep. Now we have to take a quick break, but we'll be back to discuss the foreign interference laws that have just passed in Australia after this. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Now we're discussing foreign interference laws are a fascist fraud. So last night the foreign interference bill package passed the Senate, And this
Rammed
is
through, Elisa.
Yeah, they rushed it through, of course, before these by-elections coming up. It's supposed to stop foreign interference into our pristine politics and espionage. Of course, the background is that our dangerous Anglo-American allies, so called by former PM Malcolm Fraser, the US and the UK, have told us we are to fear China and Russia. The great power rivalry with these countries is
So
the major threat.
Foreign powers are trying to influence us to fear other foreign powers.
Exactly. Now, these laws have been directed, as we've said, by the Five Eyes spying alliance, the UK, US, Canada, Australia and New Zealand. And this was admitted in a Financial Times article of the 27th of June. Australia leads Five Eyes charge against foreign interference. Now, these matters were raised in a brilliant way by Andrew Wilkie in a speech on the floor of the House of Reps on the 26th of June, which we'll watch now.
Deputy Speaker, it goes without saying that the security of our nation and maintaining that security is clearly one of the most important roles for government, and doing so as a general principle has my full support. But when it comes to the achievement of our national security, no government whatsoever has any right to ever be misleading or hypocritical. No government has any right to misuse national security in the lead up to by-elections or an election. No government has the right to take us down the road to being a police state. And I regret to say, Deputy Speaker, that there's more than a whiff of all of those concerns in these bills that we are debating here in this place today and which we will shortly vote on. Yes, we do need legislative reform to counter foreign interference and foreign espionage in our country. But the way we do it has to be ever so carefully crafted, and crafted in a way that safeguards the liberties that we hold so dear. And these bills today do not achieve that standard, and I won't support them. Indeed, I think the way they are currently presented to the Parliament, Deputy Speaker, is disappointing, and they are bad bills. I think that the fundamental deficiency in both of the bills today is in the broad definition of national security and foreign influence. Clearly, it is way too, or they are way too broad a definition, and they should have been remedied before the bill came to the House. When you look at the context, when you look at the bills we are dealing with today, and you look at the deficiencies of them, I will go so far as to say, Deputy Speaker, that Australia is in a pre-police state. We have passed far too many security laws, and far too many of them have been unnecessary. Our independent media is slowly being diminished with reductions in their funding. Papers being checked at airports with no good cause. The right to protest in these bills effectively diminished. The fact that any protest, as I said earlier, any protest such as protesting against the Adani mine, if the government wants to say it's a threat to our economic national security, then you can be accused of committing an act of espionage and be charged under these bills.
So, Elisa, what Andrew Wilkie is saying there, look, these laws are getting out of control, basically. And yesterday, to prove that point, the government arrested an ASIS whistleblower who blew the whistle on bad behaviour by the Australian government. He's now being charged for revealing what we're actually up to. And these kind of laws allow that kind of thing to happen.
That's right. So that's all we've got time for this week. Call us for a copy of the Australian Alert Service. And if you're in Western Australia, don't forget to support the campaign of Barry Mason in the upcoming by-election. Thanks for tuning in.